As a forensic accountant in Manhattan for 3 years, I had always told myself that numbers never lied. Spreadsheets revealed the truths people tried to bury. Financial patterns emerged from chaos, and every transaction left a trail. I built my entire career on that foundation, the cold logic of debits and credits, where everything balanced out eventually, even when the world around me did not. But at 6 o'clock this morning, standing in the bathroom of my small 14th floor apartment on the Upper West Side, staring at the 2 lines on a pregnancy test I had hidden in a drawer for the past 3 weeks, I understood that some truths could not be organized neatly into the vertical columns of Excel. Some secrets grew heavier the longer you held them, until they became a stone pressed against your chest, stealing your breath. 6 months. I was more than 6 months pregnant, and no one knew. The father was a stranger whose name I could not even remember. We had met at a financial conference in San Diego, one night blurred by too much alcohol and far too little judgment. After that, I flew back to New York, returned to my audits, my bank statements, my endless financial contracts, pretending nothing had happened. I hid my growing belly under dark, loose dresses and oversized coats, always carrying a large handbag to divert curious eyes at the office. I did everything I could to preserve the illusion that my life was still under control, but the thing that frightened me most was not being discovered. It was the project I was leading, an independent audit for an extraordinarily powerful client. Julian Moretti, the chief executive officer of a corporation that specialized in importing and auctioning contemporary art. For the past 2 months, I had combed through hundreds of his company's transactions, many of which carried troubling signs, large expenditures with no clear documentation, paintings purchased for 10 times their market value, money routed through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. I knew I had stumbled into something far beyond ordinary financial misstatements. It might be money laundering. It might be linked to something darker. And I knew that if I discovered something I was not meant to see, or worse, if someone realized I was the one uncovering it, then my loose dresses and oversized bag would not be enough to protect me. They would not protect the child growing inside me either. If you have made it this far and feel this story brushing against something inside you, please take a second to subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so we can keep bringing you heartfelt stories every day. And if you don't mind, tell me where you are watching from. Leave a comment and let us know which corner of the world this story has reached. We cherish every word you share. I can still recall that night in San Diego with startling clarity. A financial conference filled with hundreds of industry professionals, everyone wearing name badges and sipping wine while speaking the dry language of indices, data, and tax strategies. I arrived late because my flight had been delayed, my mind still buzzing from wrapping up a major project back in New York, and perhaps that was why I let myself relax more than usual. In the warm amber glow of the coastal hotel, with soft jazz drifting from a small stage, I met him. Tall, confident, with the kind of firm handshake that belonged to someone accustomed to making quick impressions. I don't remember his name, only that it began with a D, maybe Dominic, maybe Dylan. We laughed about the dull presentation earlier that afternoon, then shared 2 cocktails laced with orange and a hint of ginger. Everything moved quickly after that. A long hallway leading toward the elevators, fragmented conversations about work pressure, youth, the loneliness of living in big cities. I wasn't drunk enough to lose control, but just enough to let my defenses fall. That night was nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, no promises, no exchanged numbers. Just a brief lapse in the tightly controlled rhythm of my life. The next morning, I slipped out of the hotel room early, avoided eye contact with anyone in the hallway, and told myself it was over. Back in New York, I buried myself in work, in reports, in deadlines, in Monday morning meetings, in solitary dinners over cold salad. Then one morning, when I felt unusually tired, I took a test. The lines appeared in less than a minute. I sat on the bathroom floor for nearly 20 minutes, my pulse racing, my mind blank. I told myself I would end the pregnancy. I even searched online for clinics, read reviews, and hovered over appointment forms. But every time my finger approached the confirmation button, it stopped. I am not someone who believes in fate, but something inside me told me I could not do it. Not this time, not with this child. So I stayed silent. I told no friends, not my sister, not even the company physician during my routine checkup. I simply ate a little more, walked a little more, and learned to disguise my belly with fabric and borrowed confidence. But the more I hid, the more the fear grew. I feared being found out. I feared being judged. I feared losing my job. And now, as I audit the empire of Julian Moretti, a man powerful enough to reshape a person's fate, with a single phone call, I know I cannot hide forever. Because I am holding financial secrets that could topple the empire he has built over the past decade. And while I am trying to conceal a small, fragile life inside me, someone out there may be watching my every move, waiting for the moment I slip. I learned to control everything very early in life, as if it were a survival instinct. When my father died in a car accident at the age of 10, my mother nearly collapsed under the weight of her grief. She could not manage both her job and her sorrow, and I began memorizing tuition deadlines, listing unpaid bills, and teaching myself to live quietly so I would not make her cry again. Control was the only thing that made me feel safe. It became the invisible armor I wore every single day. In my work, I controlled through absolute precision. One misplaced number in a spreadsheet could cost me an entire night's sleep. My boss trusted me with major projects, clients valued my meticulousness, and colleagues respected me for always being on time, on schedule, never letting emotion intrude on data. Except this time. This time, I could not control anything. And I understood that more clearly than ever as I sat alone in my office at 10 o'clock at night, staring at the imbalance on the screen in Moretti Group's financial statement. Something was wrong. A series of wire transfers to art funds in Italy and Spain, with values that far exceeded market norms, accompanied by invoices for paintings created by obscure artists, yet priced at 10 times their actual worth. Payments broken into smaller amounts, routed through overseas accounts as if designed to avoid attention. At first, I thought it was an aggressive tax optimization technique, a clever legal loophole. But the deeper I dug, the more it resembled a sophisticated money laundering system. Everything looked clean on paper but made no sense in practice. I began saving the suspicious transactions, creating a separate file, marking each entry by date. I knew I had to be cautious. Julian Moretti was not someone people touched lightly. He did not hide his power. Calm demeanor, impeccable manners, yet his eyes always felt like they could see through whoever stood in front of him. Rumors swirled that he had ties to European oligarchs, that his art empire was nothing but a mask for something far larger. I never knew how much of that was true, and until now, I had never cared to find out. But with a folder full of irregularities in my hand and a nameless life growing inside me, this was no longer just a project. I locked the file with a password, printed a copy, and hid it in the locked drawer of my apartment. Then I continued living as though nothing had changed. I woke every morning at 6:30, ate whole grain bread and a hard-boiled egg for breakfast, walked 15 minutes to the subway, and arrived at the office before 8. I continued wearing dark dresses, carrying a large handbag to shield my belly, offering polite smiles and well-timed nods in meetings. I learned to hide my exhaustion under foundation and my anxiety behind my glasses. Every night, I lay in bed with one hand on my stomach, feeling the faint movements like ripples under the skin. My child was still growing. I did not know what kind of mother I would be, or what I would say if someone found out, yet a softer part of me surfaced each time I felt that small shift of life inside. I told myself that if I stayed careful, everything would be all right. If I could just maintain control, no one needed to know. But deep down, I understood the truth. Control was only an illusion. And once that illusion began to crack, I would not be able to mend it before everything fell apart. I met Julian Moretti for the first time on a cloudy Wednesday afternoon in the top-floor office of Moretti Group's headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. The elevator required a special access card, one issued only to me and the department head. His office was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the space lined with dark wood panels and floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the glittering skyline. He stood with his back to me, hands in his pockets, watching the traffic below as if the city were a miniature landscape in a game he controlled. He did not wear a suit, like other executives, but a simple white shirt with the sleeves neatly rolled, tall, composed, impossible to overlook. When he turned and extended his hand, I met his gaze for the first time, pale gray, deep and sharp, as though he could read every thought I had tried to hide. I introduced myself briefly, keeping my voice steady and professional. He nodded, inviting me to sit across from his walnut desk, where only a laptop, a leather file, and a small orchid in full bloom rested. He did not ask a single question about the audit or my work. Instead, he asked what I thought of abstract art, whether value lay in the strokes on a canvas or the story people attached to it. Before I could answer, he shifted to speaking about Italian wine, about the land where he was born, about how vineyards carried entire family histories that outsiders could never see. His way of speaking was strange, as if he were testing me or drawing me into a current of his own making. I maintained my composure, responding briefly, offering a polite smile at the right moments. I knew men like him, powerful men accustomed to steering everything without raising their voice, speaking in circles to see how others reacted. But Julian Moretti was more than powerful. There was something enigmatic about him, like a thin veil of smoke that obscured just enough to pull you closer. After that meeting, I found myself reassigned directly to the audit team for Moretti Group, no longer working through an intermediary. No one explained the change. The email simply arrived with clear instructions. I began receiving internal documents faster, more detailed than before. Some carried red stamps that read internal senior use only, something I had rarely been allowed to access on other projects. I could not tell whether this was a reward for professionalism or a quiet warning that I had been placed within the sightline of someone who could erase my career with a single call. Whatever it was, I kept doing my job, maintaining a calm, emotionless exterior. But inside, I felt myself being pulled into a territory where none of my old rules applied. I realized that several line items in the financial reports could not be traced back to any legitimate source, special investment categories listed under small, charities that inexplicably received 10 times their annual operating budgets. I found a pattern linking many of these transactions. They all connected to regions dominated by complex interest groups, places where the law blurred and relationships became currency. I began forming questions in my mind, but never aloud. Every time I opened my mouth, I saw Julian's eyes in my mind, as if he already knew what I suspected, what I was searching for, and what I was hiding. Then the messages started arriving, anonymous texts containing links to articles about failed money laundering investigations. One evening when I reached my apartment, I found an unmarked envelope in my mailbox, with a single sentence inside. "You are looking for something you should not know." A chill ran down my spine, though outwardly I pretended nothing had happened. I knew I had gone too far to turn back, and I knew Julian Moretti was not a man to underestimate. He was the kind who smiled when he offered his hand, but would not hesitate to let go if the person across from him stepped back. And I, even while pregnant, even while trembling, was not ready to step back. Not now. Not when I held in my hands a string of secrets I was no longer sure whether to bury or expose. I began looking at numbers differently after my meeting with Julian Moretti. Before that, they were nothing more than data, tasks, pathways leading toward financial conclusions. But after that day, they became fragments of something larger, something I was no longer sure I wanted to touch. In a transaction report sent directly to me from Moretti Group's internal department, I discovered a noteworthy payment for a painting titled The Last Light, purchased from a gallery in Lisbon for more than $300,000. When I cross-checked market quotes and the work's provenance, I found that the painting had been valued at only $15,000 in its most recent public auction 6 months earlier. I noted it down, opened several more files, and slowly realized that this was not an isolated transaction. There was an entire series of paintings and artworks bought from small European galleries, then shipped to the United States and insured at values several times higher than their original prices. All were processed through 3 subsidiaries based in Ireland, Malta, and Luxembourg. What unsettled me was not only the price discrepancies but the speed of the transactions. One painting would be bought, moved through 2 accounts in less than 24 hours, then reappraised and used as collateral for a loan from a private commercial bank in Geneva. I had worked with complex records before, but had never seen a system designed with such sophistication. This was no longer tax optimization or simple asset cleansing. This was a network, an entire financial ecosystem built to purify things people did not want traced. My instincts told me I was standing at the edge of a deep ravine, and whatever lay below was far beyond what I could imagine. Worse, someone might already have noticed my presence there. I started seeing signs that my audit files were being opened after business hours, even though the system listed them as accessed by me. I changed my password, enabled 2-factor authentication, yet a week later the access logs showed the same strange activity. I asked the tech department to check, They said it might be a software glitch or a syncing error, but the slight hesitation in the young technician's voice kept me uneasy. That night, when I left the office late and stepped out of the elevator onto the ground floor, I saw a man standing near my car, a phone in his hand but his eyes fixed on the glass doors. When I approached, he walked off immediately, saying nothing, never turning back. I waited a few minutes, inspected my car carefully, then finally mustered the courage to drive home. Inside, I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that anxiety from the baby and the pressure of work was making me overly sensitive. But I could not deny the feeling and intuition like breath on my neck that someone was watching, counting my steps, waiting for me to make one wrong move so they could pull me into a spiral I would never escape. I spent the weekend reviewing every piece of data again, printing comparison sheets, highlighting each item, storing 2 backup copies on separate drives. I knew I could not confide in anyone at the company. What I was seeing was too large, too dangerous, possibly connected to people whose names should never be spoken lightly. While printing the documents, I felt the baby kick, just the faintest tap, like a reminder. I placed my hand over my belly and breathed slowly. This was no longer just a job. This was about my safety, and my child's. And I knew I had to keep going, to uncover the full picture before someone else tore the pieces out of my hands. The call came on a Monday morning as I sat at my desk, finishing the last sip of coffee before opening the week's audit files. The phone displayed an unfamiliar number, no recognizable area code. I hesitated for a moment before answering. The voice on the line was low, firm, and needed no introduction. I knew immediately it was Julian Moretti. He asked to meet me that day, bypassing the office and any legal representatives. No confirmation email, no specific reason, only that he had something to discuss in person and wanted me at an address in Soho at 3 o'clock. I paused briefly, then agreed. After hanging up, I sat frozen for nearly 5 minutes, staring at my computer screen without seeing a single line of text. The address he gave was a small art gallery tucked between 2 old buildings on Prince Street. There was no signboard, only a frosted glass door and a tiny bell that chimed as I stepped inside. The space was so quiet I could hear my own footsteps on the wooden floor. Light from the overhead windows spilled across the paintings on the walls, mostly abstract works in cool tones, their brushstrokes like wandering emotions without beginning or end. Julian stood in the far corner, hands in his pockets, gazing at a deep red canvas streaked with sharp lines that resembled cuts. When he turned around, his eyes were as calm as always, yet something in the way he looked at me had shifted. No polite small talk, no introductory questions, only a slight nod and an invitation to sit across from him at a low table against the wall. He placed a brown envelope in front of me. I opened it. Inside were copies of hospital bills bearing my name, from a prenatal clinic on the Upper West Side, ultrasounds, blood tests, prescriptions for iron supplements, my name printed clearly on every page. For a few seconds, my heart simply stopped. I looked up, ready to speak, but my throat locked tight. Julian did not say anything at first. He just watched me, waiting, as though he had known the truth long before handing me the envelope. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep and unnervingly steady. "When were you going to tell me?" It was not an accusation, not anger, just a bare question, sharp as a blade slicing straight into the defenses I had built for months. I stayed silent. In that moment, words felt useless. I felt exposed, stripped of every hiding place. I tightened my grip on my handbag as if clinging to the last fragment of composure I had left. "I did not think this had anything to do with work," I whispered. Julian leaned back slightly, studying me with a patience that felt almost dangerous. "The issue is that everything becomes connected when someone is being watched. Did you know your bank account was accessed illegally 3 times in the past month?" I stared at him, stunned. "I did not know." He leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "I have reason to believe that the people tied to the financial network you are auditing not only know about you but are attempting to silence you. How? I cannot yet determine, but you need to be far more careful." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening with fear and shame all at once. I had believed I could hide everything, my personal secret, the truth buried in the numbers. I had been wrong. Julian watched me quietly, then rose and walked to the bookshelf beside him. He pulled out a file and set it before me. "This is the rest of what you need to see. I do not want to hide anything from you, but from this point onward, You must decide exactly where you stand, and you cannot make that decision if you keep trying to live with two faces. I did not answer immediately. I only nodded, took the file, and left. As I stepped out of the gallery, the sky seemed darker, even though it was barely 4 o'clock. And for the first time in 5 months, I felt myself losing control completely. I sat at my desk through the entire night, my eyes fixed on every line in the file Julian Moretti had given me, every figure, every account name, every tiny annotation nearly blending into the paper itself. These were documents that did not exist in any reporting system I had ever accessed, records ordinary people would never be permitted to see. And now they were spread open before me, like a silent challenge from a man I still did not know whether to trust or fear. There were steady transfers to accounts in Zurich, Monaco, and Dubai. The recipients' names never repeated, yet they all shared one detail. Each belonged to private investment funds, protected by extraordinarily strict banking secrecy laws. I discovered a recurring pattern, a nearly perfect flow of money designed to leave no obvious trace. But if studied long enough and closely enough, a faint current of shifting assets emerged. And it was not only money. In a quiet, attached appendix was a list of artworks transported by private shipments through small, discreet customs stops across Europe. I recognized the names of several pieces from notable auctions, their purchase prices suspiciously low compared to market value. One had been bought for under $20,000, then reassessed only a few months later for more than $300,000. Some transactions were signed by Julian himself. Other names were unfamiliar but bore identification codes that matched records I had seen in earlier banking data. I did not know how far I was traveling into this labyrinth, only that every page I turned pulled me deeper into a world where traditional financial logic no longer applied. I felt disoriented, my mind spinning, as if everything I had learned in college and every professional standard I had relied upon was being bent into an unfamiliar shape with its own rules. But what tightened my chest was not the complexity of the numbers, it was the growing certainty that I was being watched. 3 days after the meeting in Soho, I received an unmarked package containing a small USB drive. When I plugged it into my personal computer, a video file appeared, pulled from the hallway camera of my apartment building. In it, I saw myself leaving my unit the previous morning, followed moments later by a man in a baseball cap, his face nearly obscured. My stomach clenched as he paused outside my door, leaned down as if inspecting something, then walked away. There was no note, no threat, nothing explicit, yet the message was unmistakable. They knew where I lived. I did not know who they were, but I began to understand why Julian said I was being monitored. And worse, I began to realize he had not exaggerated. I backed up all the documents into 2 separate copies, leaving one in the office safe, and sending another to an off-site storage box outside the city in case anything happened to me. I scaled back my personal activities, canceled appointments, altered my routes. Even so, the feeling of being shadowed stayed with me. Julian contacted me more frequently, though always through disposable phone numbers. His voice remained calm, but every call ended with the same sentence, repeated like a warning etched into stone. If you notice anything unusual, call me immediately. I could not tell whether he was protecting me or controlling me. Sometimes I wondered if I was being pulled into a larger network, a hidden machinery where I was nothing more than a pawn, a tool meant to cleanse something I still did not fully understand. But each night, when I rested my hand on my belly and felt the small movements inside, I knew I could not stop. I could not turn away, could not pretend I had not seen what I had seen, and could not abandon the thing growing both within me and beyond me. And I began to understand that this was no longer a battle between me and Julian, between truth and numbers, but between a woman 5 months pregnant and a world governed by power, money, and secrets protected at all costs. I first noticed the black car on a Friday morning as I left my building. It was parked across the street, a mid-sized sedan with dark-tinted windows and no front license plate. At first, I assumed it belonged to a resident, but when I stepped through the lobby doors and glanced back, the car remained unmoving, even after the traffic light had changed 3 times. A chill crept along my spine, but I forced myself to keep walking toward the subway as usual. After that, I began seeing it everywhere. Sometimes near the office, sometimes a block away from my apartment, always far enough to avoid suspicion, yet close enough for me to feel its presence like a steady heartbeat behind me. One late afternoon, after an internal meeting, I saw it again under the shade of a tree near the emergency exit. I paused and pretended to check my phone, catching a glimpse in the rearview mirror of a man sitting in the driver's seat. He wore a baseball cap and dark glasses, his face buried in shadow, but something in the stillness of his posture told me he was not there by chance. I turned and walked in the opposite direction, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The sensation of being hunted seeped into every corner of my day as the weeks dragged on. I checked the door locks 3 times each night, changed the lock entirely, and installed a small hidden security camera in the hallway. I knew it was not enough, but it was all I could do. I could not call the police. There was no evidence, no threat, no explicit crime, only intuition, unease, and shadows in a life I once believed was under my control. I told Julian during our next call. He was not surprised. He paused only a moment before saying, "I will have someone look into it. In the meantime, change your schedule. Avoid being alone at night." I followed his instructions. I changed my route to work every day, took earlier trains, came home later, and always lingered in crowded stores if I sensed danger. But the more I adjusted, the more I felt myself tightening inside a trap I could not see. One night, while making a simple dinner of pasta and steamed vegetables, I heard a knock. 3 taps, not fast, not slow. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. No one. The hallway was empty, eerily still. I waited a few seconds, then opened the door. A folded piece of paper lay on the floor. Inside was a single sentence: "Stop while you still can." No signature, no mark, nothing. I sank to the ground, my belly tightening, a dull ache spreading along my lower back as I closed my eyes and breathed. The baby kicked, as if sensing my fear. I tore the note into pieces, dropped it into the sink, and turned the water on full force. Then I called Julian, but this time he did not answer. I left a short message, my voice unsteady. The next morning, I requested a 3-day leave, citing health reasons and exhaustion. I needed to pull back, not out of fear but because I could not continue analyzing financial flows when my mind was being torn apart by constant dread. During those 3 days, I rarely stepped outside. I stayed in my small apartment, reading through every document again, trying to fit the scattered fragments into a larger picture. I knew I had gone deep enough to see the structure behind the data, but not deep enough to understand who stood at its center, and I knew the man in the black car was not alone. He was simply the first shadow in a long line of faces I would eventually have to confront, whether I wanted to or not. The 3 days of leave passed like a slow, strained dream in which I could not truly rest. Every small sound in the hallway startled me. Every unfamiliar footstep outside my door made me hold my breath. When I returned to the office on Monday morning, I sensed something had shifted even though everyone still greeted me with their usual polite smiles. On my desk was a small bouquet with no sender's name, white peonies arranged in a simple round glass vase. I did not know who had sent them, or whether they were a gesture of goodwill or a warning, but for a brief, fragile moment I wanted to believe someone was still on my side. The morning passed without incident, until I noticed a subtle change in the internal server system. Several files I had secured with private passwords had been renamed. Not deleted, not altered, just renamed, as if someone had slipped into the one place I believed was safest and left a quiet fingerprint behind. I closed my laptop, breathed slowly, and tried to keep my composure. Inside me, a thin sheet of ice was beginning to crack along invisible lines. In the afternoon, I was called to Human Resources for an unscheduled meeting. The department head, a woman named Karen whom I had worked with on a few prior projects, sat across from me wearing a gentle yet tightly controlled expression. She informed me that the company was conducting a full security audit of the system due to suspected information breaches. She said no one was being singled out, but that all internal data access would be monitored more closely, and asked me to sign a compliance form for the updated protocols. I signed without speaking, though inside I understood perfectly that this was not protection. This was surveillance. From that day on, I lived in a constant state of tension. Every keystroke on my computer was recorded. Every email sent, every file opened, was tracked by the newly installed system. I could no longer guess how many eyes were watching what I did. I began using my personal laptop for sensitive analysis, working after hours, storing documents on encrypted drives and taking them home. But I knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed. Julian still contacted me, though less often. Once, he called in the middle of the night only to tell me to stay safe and avoid the subway during peak hours. When I asked why, he did not answer, only saying there were movements within the system. I had no idea what system he meant, but I sensed with painful clarity that I was standing in the center of a vortex that pulled me deeper the more I tried to resist it. I noticed a new man appearing at the cafe beneath the building every morning. He never ordered anything, just sat in the corner pretending to scroll through his phone. When I walked in, his eyes followed me for the briefest second, but long enough for me to understand he was not there by accident. One evening, leaving the office close to 9, I saw a shadow near the parking area. When I looked again, it vanished into the alley behind the building. I did not chase after it, did not scream. I simply walked quickly toward the subway, my hand gripping my bag strap tightly. I felt a mild tightening in my belly, each step heavier than the one before. My child was growing day by day in a world where I no longer trusted anyone. I began sleeping fitfully, waking from dreams of being trapped in a glass maze where every exit led to a dead end. I would wake with cold sweat beading on my forehead, hands clutching my stomach as if letting go would mean losing the baby forever. Some nights I turned on every light in the apartment and sat on the sofa until dawn, unable to shake the feeling that my life was no longer my own, but a performance witnessed by someone hidden in the dark. Yet every morning I still got up, dressed for work, opened my computer, and analyzed numbers as if nothing had happened. I did not know what awaited me, but one truth rang clear. I was no longer simply an auditor doing her job. I was a woman carrying a child, standing against a system of power I did not fully understand. And even if I had to move in silence, I would not step back. I could not. Not when all I had left was my clarity and the last scraps of courage to protect the only thing that had not yet been taken from me. I realized I could no longer hide my secret on the morning I entered a second-floor conference room and met the eyes of Natalie, a colleague from the internal audit team. She was usually quiet, neat, rule-bound, but this time her gaze held hesitation and something like regret. When the meeting ended, she stayed, behind, her voice low and quick, as if afraid others might hear. "They know, Haley." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Know what?" Natalie looked directly into my eyes without blinking. "Your pregnancy, and what you've been doing with the data." She said nothing more, only left the weight of that look before turning away as though speaking the words had already put her at risk. I did not ask who they were. I didn't need to. For the next week, I sensed the shift in everyone around me. Some colleagues avoided eye contact. Others asked unnecessary, oddly timed questions like whether I planned to take maternity leave or whether I felt well. No one said anything openly, but every silence felt heavy. I knew something was forming behind that wall of quiet, a plan, a response, a way to contain the fallout. On Thursday afternoon, I was summoned to the 18th floor, usually reserved for board meetings. When I entered, I found Julian sitting alone at the long table, no documents before him, only a small espresso cup. He gestured for me to sit, said nothing polite, nothing introductory. I sat with my back straight, my breath steady. Julian said it was time for a candid conversation. I had stepped into territory few ever ventured this deeply. What I had seen, analyzed, saved, these were no longer data. They were weapons. I asked him what he intended to do with me. He was silent for a few seconds, then answered with a sentence that sent a chill through me, even as its full meaning remained out of reach. "That depends on whether you keep your promise." I clenched my hands beneath the table, my voice low but firm. "I never intended to betray anyone. I am only doing my job." His face did not change. "But you are also carrying a life. And that makes everything more complicated." I did not know whether he was concerned for me, for the baby, or for himself. Perhaps all three. Julian continued, saying he was willing to ensure my safety and my child's, as long as I remained silent. No reports, no disclosures, no sharing anything outside. He did not use the word threat. Yet in the way he shaped the sentence, I heard it clearly. If I chose to speak, there would be no place on earth safe enough for me to live an ordinary life again. I asked him why he trusted me. He replied, "Because you still come here every day even though you know you're being watched. Because you haven't sold the information to anyone. And because, In the end, I am the one who had your medical records delivered to you." I looked up at him, stunned. He admitted that he had known about my pregnancy even before our meeting in the Soho gallery. Someone in his network worked at the clinic where I had my first appointment. He had been watching me from the beginning. I wanted to be angry, to react, to tell him he had crossed every ethical line. But no words came, because I knew in the world I had stepped into, ethics no longer existed in any shape I once believed in. Finally, I nodded, not fully, agreeing, but acknowledging that I understood. I would not say anything. Not because I feared Julian, but because I feared what might happen if I disrupted the fragile balance keeping me and my child from the edge. When I left the 18th floor meeting room, the afternoon sun had completely faded. The entire city seemed covered in a thin veil of mist, and for the first time in months, I felt an unfamiliar emptiness settle inside me. No anger, no panic, only a vast quietness, large enough to swallow every thought. And in that stillness, I understood with perfect clarity that I had just traded my freedom to protect the small, growing life inside my womb. I kept my promise to stay silent, at least on the surface, but inside I could not stop myself from tracing the threads of what I had already uncovered. I did not open new files, did not download new data, did not leave any sign within the system that could raise suspicion. Yet every evening after work, in the small solitude of my apartment, I opened the encrypted copy of the dataset, sat beneath the soft amber light of my living room, and wrote down each transaction line by line, every fragment of a puzzle I still could not complete. It was no longer work. It had become a compulsion, as though if I did not reach the full truth, then everything I had endured, everything I had sacrificed, would become meaningless. On nights when I stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning, my belly would tighten gently, a quiet reminder that I was no longer alone. The baby continued to grow every day despite the chaos swirling around my life. I began noticing a chain of recurring accounts embedded in the hundreds of cross-border entries, an investment fund headquartered in Belize, ostensibly for educational development, but in reality funneling money into shell companies buying properties across the United States, cleansing the origins of the funds. One of these companies had direct ties to a nonprofit Julian had publicly supported 3 years ago. Everything connected, but one last piece was missing, and I knew that piece was not inside the spreadsheets. It was inside a person. I sought out Natalie, the colleague who had warned me in silence. We met on a drizzly afternoon at a cafe far from downtown, a place without cameras and without familiar faces. I told her plainly that I needed help, that I had no intention of exposing anything, that I only wanted to understand everything before becoming a mother. She looked at me for a long moment, then exhaled. She said she had once witnessed something similar, a former employee who uncovered an illegal financial network and was transferred to an Asian branch before disappearing from the company altogether. No one spoke his name again, no records, no resignation notice, as though he had never existed. I asked whether she had kept anything, any document at all. She shook her head, then pulled a small memory card from her pocket and placed it in my hand. On it was a recording of an internal call between 2 senior executives, casually discussing how to handle discreetly employees who were too curious. I took it home and played it over and over until I memorized every breath in it. It was not enough to incriminate anyone, but enough to confirm that what I was chasing was real, and enough to tell me I was dangerously close to the edge. 2 days later, as I was walking home from the subway, a stranger approached and dropped a paper bag right at my feet. When I bent down to help him pick it up, he whispered in a flat, emotionless voice, "Do not go back into the system if you want to give birth safely." I stood frozen after he walked away, the cold wind scraping along my neck, crowds streaming past me as though nothing in the world had shifted. It was the first time I understood the tangible price of pursuing the truth. Not metaphor, not suggestion, but threat, survival, a choice. A few days later, Julian called. This time there were no veiled hints, no circles of conversation. He said plainly that if I wished to leave the project, he would arrange another position for me, even in another city. He told me to think of the baby and stop while I still could, but I did not answer immediately. Instead, I told him I needed time. I could not tell whether he was genuinely concerned for me or simply trying to extinguish a potential explosion before it ignited. But one thing was certain. I was standing before the greatest decision of my life. Walk away and pretend I had never known anything, or continue and pay the price that truth always demanded. That night, sitting alone in the dark with my hand resting over the curve of my belly, I knew I could not let go. Not now. Not when I had come this far. Everything began with an eerie quiet. No more black sedans parked across the street. No more strange men sitting in the cafe each morning. No more quick glances in the hallway that vanished the second I looked back. No warnings, no signs. Just an unnatural silence that frightened me more than the days of being openly watched. I knew this was not retreat. This was transition. They were shifting strategies. I felt it in every passing moment, in the pacing of people around me, even in the calm, unreadable nod Julian gave me in the elevator as though nothing had ever happened. I steadied myself, kept going to work on time, finished every assigned task, and revealed nothing on my face. But inside, a storm churned. I backed up everything onto a new hard drive and hid it where no one would think to look. I also wrote a brief report, vague but complete enough to understand the whole picture, and sealed it in an envelope labeled, "Send to the Federal Bureau of Investigation if I disappear." I told no one, left no digital trace, trusted only paper and ink. And then they struck, precisely when I believed I had regained some control. It happened on a Saturday morning as I walked to my prenatal appointment. The air was cold and carried, the metallic scent of the Hudson River, and I moved slowly along the sidewalk near the subway station. I sensed something wrong when I heard footsteps behind me, too steady, too synchronized, always 3 paces away. When I stopped in front of a bakery window, the footsteps stopped too. I turned, but saw no one, only a running delivery truck idling at the curb. I had no time to think. A heavy force slammed into me from behind, knocking me forward onto the pavement. My vision blurred, a ringing filled my ears, and for a few seconds my body refused to respond. When I finally managed to lift my head, I saw a shadow sprinting away, not taking my wallet, not grabbing my bag, just running, as though the task was complete. Instinctively, I wrapped my arms around my belly as a sharp pain pulsed through my lower back. A woman nearby screamed, and then chaos erupted. I was taken to the hospital with mild injuries, but the doctor insisted on close monitoring due to unusual contractions. Lying in the stark white room, staring at the ceiling, I felt hollow, so hollow I could no longer feel fear. I understood the message. It was not theft, not accident. It was a warning, a clear one. Enough for me to know that if I continued, the next time would not be so simple. Julian did not call, did not text, but I knew he knew, and I also knew I no longer had a choice. After 2 days of monitoring, I was discharged. The baby was safe, but the doctor urged complete rest and no stress. I laughed quietly inside. How could someone living with fear every day avoid stress? I formally resigned, citing my health. Julian did not resist, did not ask questions. The process went smoothly, too smoothly, like he had prepared the exit long before I asked for it. In the final confirmation email, he added one sentence that chilled me. "Thank you for keeping your promise." I closed my laptop and sat in stillness, my hand over my stomach and tears slipping down without a sound. I did not know what would come next. I only knew they had delivered their warning, and I was still alive but only under the condition of silence. The truth I carried had become a debt I could never repay, a scar I would bear for the rest of my life, and I understood now that the price of knowing too much was never a bullet or a courtroom. It was fear, permanent, lingering, and impossible to escape. Giving birth in the 8th month was never part of any plan I had imagined for myself. But life, no matter how carefully scripted, always finds a way to push you off your axis with the most unexpected turn. It happened on a March afternoon, when the sky abruptly opened into rain despite the soft sunlight that had warmed the morning. I was organizing my notebooks in the small apartment when the first contraction hit, sharp and violent, like a blade twisting straight into my lower abdomen. I collapsed onto the floor, cold sweat pooling at the nape of my neck. When I struggled to reach for my phone, the second wave came, accompanied by the unmistakable wetness between my legs. My water had broken. I knew I had no time. In panic, I dialed emergency services and whispered my address before everything went dark. When I woke, I was in the delivery room, the harsh white lights blurred by tears. A nurse gently wiped my forehead, telling me I was dilating and needed to breathe steadily. I nodded weakly, gripping the rail of the bed, and at that moment the door opened. Julian stood there in a dark suit, his face stripped of its usual armor, shock unmasked in every line. I had no idea who had called him, maybe one of the people who had been following me, or maybe he had never stopped keeping an eye on me from afar. But it wasn't his presence that startled me. It was the expression in his eyes. Not power, not calculation, real fear. He stepped closer, saying nothing, placing a hand on my shoulder, just a simple gesture. But in that moment I no longer had strength left to resist. The next contraction tore through me and I screamed, my entire body trembling. I could not hold anything inside anymore. Between breaths and pain, I whispered into his ear everything I had hidden, every truth I had carried alone for months. I told him about the transactions I had traced, the mirrored dataset I kept, the memory card Natalie had given me, the man on the street who had warned me to stop. Julian said nothing, just bowed his head as he listened, his fingers tightening gently around my hand as though it was the only way he knew how to hold me steady in the chaos. And then I told him I was afraid. Not afraid of dying, but afraid that this child would grow up in a world where truth could be buried under money and threats. I told him I did not want his protection, did not need his explanations. I wanted only one thing: to live, to raise my child, without being hunted. When I finished, tears rolled down my face, merging with the rhythm of pain emptying me from the inside out. Julian remained silent, but something in his eyes shifted as if a stone wall he had built around himself had cracked ever so slightly. The doctors asked him to step out when the final stage of labor began. He left, but before the door closed, he turned back to me with a small nod. Not a promise, not a goodbye. Simply an acknowledgement that he had heard, understood, and knew what he must do. I gave birth after nearly 4 hours of battling pain and hope. A tiny baby girl, fragile and flushed red, yet strong enough to let out her first cry like a proclamation that she had arrived in this world despite every barrier that tried to keep her out. I held her in my arms, overcome with exhaustion, and a feeling I had never known before, relief so deep it felt like release. In that moment, I did not think of Julian, or the data, or the shadows beyond the hospital door. I thought only of the soft breaths in my arms, and the vow I had whispered into the ear of a man who carried too many secrets. I had spoken, and now I would wait to see whether the truth would let me go or continue collecting its debt. But one thing I knew: if there was any justice left in this world, then in that moment, with her cry against my chest, I had won. Not the powerful men, not the ones who threatened me, but a mother, alone yet unbroken, who had finally spoken what she had kept buried in her heart. I stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks for postpartum monitoring, and in that time there wasn't a single day when I didn't think of what I had told Julian under those blinding delivery room lights. I didn't know what he had done with the information, or whether someone else had heard it, but I knew that the quiet after birth was only a brief pause before everything began moving again in ways I could no longer control. On Friday morning, as I was nursing my daughter and watching her small face sleep against my chest, the door swung open. A woman in a light gray suit, carrying a file and a badge marked Federal Bureau of Investigation, stepped inside. She introduced herself as Special Agent Claire Henderson, her voice calm, each word pronounced with precise clarity, without any urgency. I instinctively held my baby closer. Claire sat in the chair beside my bed and told me they had been tracking suspicious financial activity connected to the corporation I once worked for, and that my name had appeared in an anonymous report sent to the Bureau's headquarters in Washington 2 days earlier. She never said who sent it, but I knew instantly. Julian? My throat tightened. My palms grew damp as Claire opened the file on the table, a complete set of the encrypted documents I had hidden so carefully, the memory card from Natalie, the analytical notes I had never shown anyone but myself. Claire said they did not see me as a suspect, but as a key witness. Then she said the sentence that nearly made me break down. "We are here to protect you." The words washed over me like cool water over burns. I asked whether I would have to testify publicly, whether my identity would be exposed. Claire shook her head. The investigation was in early stages, and their priority was ensuring safety for me and my daughter. She gave me an emergency contact number, a list of witness protection options, and advised me seriously to consider leaving New York soon. I asked her again quietly who had sent the documents. Claire looked at me for a long moment before answering softly, "Someone trying to make something right." I did not need anything more to understand the choice Julian had made. Perhaps he had not done it for me, but for my daughter, or for the remnants of his conscience long buried under wealth and power. But no matter the reason, I was grateful. When I was discharged, 2 agents escorted me, not visibly armed, but always close enough. I was moved to a government safe house nearly 3 hours outside the city, in a quiet suburb where everything was stripped down to essentials. No personal phones, no social media, no contact with anyone, outside the approved list. I lived in silence again, but this time it was not the silence of fear, it was the silence of someone preparing for a new beginning. My daughter, whom I named Lily, grew stronger each day. I nursed her, sang her the lullabies my mother used to sing to me, and whenever I looked into her eyes, I felt how far I had traveled to protect her life. A week later, Claire returned with the first update. The anonymous report had triggered a sweeping federal investigation, and multiple accounts had been frozen. Several senior executives had been summoned. Julian was not among them. I did not ask why. Some things were better left unknown. But Claire added that he had resigned from the board, liquidated all his holdings, and withdrawn from every business venture. He left New York just days after Lily was born. No one knew where he had gone. I simply nodded, unsure whether what I felt was relief or sorrow. Julian had kept his word, and I, somehow, had survived. At night, in the safe house, I would carry Lily onto the small balcony, look out at the scattered lights in the distance, and think of the numbers, the reports, the threats, and the man who once embodied all of it. Now, in my arms, there was only a small life and a future I could not yet see. But one thing was certain. The truth, though delayed, had finally spoken, and whatever price had been paid, I no longer regretted believing in it. I returned to New York on a late summer morning when the trees in the park had just begun to wear their soft green and the sunlight had gentled after the harsh months before. Claire told me the investigation had moved into its final phase, and I was no longer considered a high-risk target requiring urgent protection. Many pieces were still unclear, a few key figures not yet brought into the light, but I had been granted permission to return to my life, or at least the fragments of it that could still be called ordinary. I came back with Lily, who was almost 6 months old then, her hair growing in soft tufts, her eyes wide and curious as if she were trying to understand the whole world in one glance. We rented a smaller apartment in a quieter corner of Brooklyn, where no one knew who I was and I made no effort for anyone to find out. I took on small freelance bookkeeping jobs for local businesses, just enough to keep us afloat while allowing me to spend most of my time with Lily. Some days I sat by the window watching her sleep in her crib and wondered if this was the peace I had once dreamed of. Not long after settling in, I received a parcel with no return address. Inside was a small oil painting of a Venetian harbor at sunset, the brushwork so familiar that I recognized the hand instantly. A note written in blue ink accompanied it. Only one line. "Thank you for trusting me." No signature, but I didn't need one. Julian. I didn't know where he was, how he was living, or whether he kept in touch with anyone from that old world. But, through that painting, I understood he was trying to say he still existed somewhere at the edge of my life, and my daughter's. I didn't call, didn't write back, didn't try to reach him. Between us, silence was perhaps the only safe language left for the things that could not be spoken. In July that year, Natalie called. She told me she had resigned and was now teaching accounting at a community college. Her voice had changed, softer, as if she too had stepped out of the shadows and chosen a different kind of life. We met at a park near my home. Lily lay in her stroller, reaching for the leaves drifting in the wind, and Natalie sat beside me on the bench, her gaze gentle on the baby. She said perhaps we each survived in our own way, and that was enough. I nodded, feeling a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't know what the future held, or whether someone might one day knock on my door and pull me back into that old world, but I had learned to live with the unknown. I began writing down my story, not to publish, but so that Lily might one day understand why her mother had chosen that path, why I had stayed silent through the early years of her life. I wanted her to know that not all silence is avoidance. Sometimes it is the only way to keep safe what we love most. One late afternoon, as I changed her diaper, she suddenly looked up at me and smiled for the first time, a round, fearless smile. In that moment, I knew I had done the right thing. We were not a perfect family, not a household with a father at the table or warm dinners every night, but we were a family one held together by truth, by courage, and by a love that did not need to be named. And sometimes, that was enough. I never imagined leaving New York. That city, tangled with chaotic memories and ghosts of the past, had always been the place I belonged, where every beginning and ending had unfolded. But motherhood teaches you something. When you love a life with all that remains in your heart, you learn to let go even of the things you once thought you could never live without. When Lily turned 1, I began to feel the city's weight pressing on me. Not because of the crowds or the swift pace, but because every street corner, every cafe, every tall office building reminded me of a version of myself that had to die so another could survive. I needed new space, a place where my daughter and I wouldn't be forced to look back so much, where the future could be rewritten in warmer tones. Napa Valley came to me as an unexpected suggestion from Natalie, who had once attended a workshop at a community college there. She said it was peaceful, sunlit, clean, with vineyards stretching toward the horizon. I researched it and felt my heart soften just looking at the images on my screen. We moved at the end of spring. I sold most of our belongings, brought only what we needed, and drove across nearly 3,000 miles in an old car sturdy enough to carry us. The trip took almost a week. We slept in roadside motels, stopped in small, unfamiliar towns where Lily touched grass for the first time, and laughed as she dipped her feet in cool streams. I had never seen her that happy. When we arrived in Napa, I rented a small house with a red-tiled roof and a front porch large enough for a rocking chair. Behind it was an orange grove in bloom, and beyond that, a sea of green vineyards without end. I started working for a family-owned winery, not in auditing, but simple bookkeeping, helping track expenses and prepare seasonal reports. The work wasn't stressful, and no one cared who I had once been. They knew only that I was a single mother, with eyes always on her child, and a silence that people instinctively respected. Lily grew up between sunlight, wind, and the tenderness of nature. She loved running barefoot on the earth, picking wildflowers, and sitting for long stretches listening to me tell stories in a soft, drifting voice even when I wasn't sure whom the stories were really about. I no longer needed to hide those memories. They became quiet fragments inside me, no longer sharp, only faint notes in a long song. One afternoon, while sorting paperwork in the winery's small office, I received another envelope. This time it held a single black and white photograph. A man standing with his back to the camera, wearing a fedora, hands in his pockets, looking out at a vast open sea. No letter, no return address, but I knew it was him. Julian was alive somewhere, perhaps beginning again in his own way. I stared at the photo for a long time, then tucked it into the front page of the notebook I was writing for Lily. Not as a memory, but as a reminder that sometimes the people who pass through our lives are not meant to stay until the end. They are meant to push us farther, to places we never believed we could reach. And I had gone far. From a fateful night in San Diego to a small apartment in Brooklyn, from the days of surveillance to Lily's first cry, and now to Napa Valley, where the sun sets behind soft rolling hills and life moves slowly, like the shimmer of red wine catching the afternoon light. I don't know how long we will stay here, but for the first time in many years, I am not afraid of the question. As summer in Napa Valley slowly shifted into fall, ripe grapes were gathered by the basketful, and the scent drifting from the winery mingled with the cool air in a way that made everything feel softer, gentler. Lily had begun to walk, taking small, unsteady steps on the gravel path in front of the house, her arms swinging wildly without direction, her eyes brightening every time I called her name. I began to feel, more clearly than ever, the shape of a new life, one without the jarring nightmares that used to wake me in the middle of the night, without the suspicious glances of strangers on the subway, without nameless phone calls thudding through my chest like a warning. Here, I could breathe, I could smile, and I could allow myself to think about things that lived beyond fear. It was in that quiet space that I met Daniel. He was the agricultural engineer at the winery, a few years older than me, gentle and soft-spoken, with deep brown eyes, the color of earth, and a smile that always arrived slowly, like late afternoon sunlight. At first, we exchanged only brief conversations about work, the numbers, the harvest, the seasons. But then he began leaving peeled oranges on my desk each morning, along with a small note that read, "Don't forget to take a lunch break today." It was the first time in years I had laughed at something so simple. Daniel never asked where I came from, never tried to uncover the past I carried. He accepted me as I was, as if he understood that some stories should only be told when their keeper is ready. Every afternoon after work, he paused for a few minutes to greet Lily, lifting her in his arms and spinning her gently in the sunlight until she burst into laughter as though the world had never known darkness. He once told me he had lost his father when he was young, and that his mother raised 3 children by baking bread in a small Oregon town. Perhaps that was why he had such a natural way with children, not overbearing, not awkward, just a presence steady enough to make me trust him. We started seeing each other more often, without planning it, without naming it. A simple dinner on the porch, an afternoon picking wild berries at the edge of the field, a moment when he knelt down to fix Lily's stroller after the front wheel loosened. Everything arrived as gently as groundwater slipping through the cracks of my own healing soul. I never thought I would love again, not after everything, but some things don't need planning. They simply grow, slowly, quietly, until you realize your heart is no longer locked shut. One late evening after Lily had fallen asleep, I sat beside Daniel on the porch with a cup of hot tea in my hands, the breeze carrying a faint scent of fermenting grapes. I told him a part of my story, not the details, just the major milestones, the invisible cuts that still ached. He didn't rush to comfort me or fill the silence. He simply nodded, sat quietly for a long moment, and then said a sentence that almost made me cry. "Thank you for surviving." It wasn't praise, it was recognition. And in that instant, I knew I stood at a crossroads. I could continue living closed off, shielding Lily from every possible risk by avoiding all attachments, or I could open my heart again and accept that love, too, might be part of healing. I didn't answer him that night, but a few days later, I invited him to dinner, and for the first time in years, I cooked the tomato pasta dish I had made on the night I discovered I was pregnant. A quiet circle closed, not with lightning strike romance, but with the steady tenderness of 2 people who had both been hurt. When Lily fell asleep on his shoulder that first night, the 3 of us sat together. I knew I had chosen, and this time, I didn't choose out of fear or escape. I chose out of love. I once believed some truths were better buried forever, that silence was the safest way to protect the people we love. But time, love, and Lily taught me that nothing grows stronger than truth, and no darkness survives forever if you are brave enough to step beyond it. Life in Napa Valley wasn't perfect. There were still exhausting days, long nights when Lily had a fever or woke crying, but I no longer hid any part of myself. I could laugh honestly watching Daniel play with Lily in the soft morning light. I could sit down and write this story not to regret, not to punish myself, but to remind myself that I survived all of it with the quiet resilience and unconditional love of a mother. Every wound left a mark, and I carried those marks as part of my becoming, no longer shameful, no longer feared, because the truth, even when painful, had given me a new beginning, a chance to live more honestly, to love more deeply, and to face the future with the belief that no matter how dark the past was, hope could still grow from the most unexpected places. My story isn't extraordinary. It is just one among millions about choice, courage, and the longing to live as one's true self. But if you are lost right now, if you are hiding something that keeps you from being who you are, I hope you know there is a way out. There are kind people still, new beginnings still, and a future not defined by your past. We do not need to be perfect to deserve love. We only need to be honest with ourselves, and brave enough to believe that tomorrow can be softer than today. And if this story touches you, please let us know. How did you feel listening to this journey? Did any part remind you of your own life? Is there a woman you once knew who stood between fear and courage the way I did? I hope you will share your feelings from the deepest part of your heart in the comments below. Every message from you is the encouragement that allows us to continue telling true, emotional stories that carry meaning. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who might need a little light from these simple yet profound moments in life. Our channel will continue bringing heartfelt, inspiring stories every day. Thank you for staying until the end. I wish you good health, gentle days, and the kind of happiness that comes quietly in the most ordinary moments. I am today's storyteller, and I wish you well until the next video. Goodbye, and I hope to see you again soon.